Well, good evening and welcome to tonight's program. This is the third in a series of programs related to the sesquicentennial or 150th anniversary of the Modoc War. And tonight we're focusing on images. And in cooperation with the Klamath County Museum and this wonderful institution, the Merrill Historical and Modoc War Museum. Tonight, we're going to focus on the iconic photographs that were taken by war correspondents who came to Northern California during the events of the war. My name is Mark Blackburn, and I'm the manager for visitor services at Lava Beds National Monument. And if you didn't grab a program, there at the front, you'll need a set of 3D glasses. If you don't have a set of 3D glasses, we're setting them out now. We're using technology tonight, so hopefully everything will work. And we're going to start our program off with Todd Kepple, who's the executive director of the Klamath Museum. And then we're going to have a presentation online by Eric Gleason, an archaeologist who formerly worked for the Park Service and did work at Captain Jack's stronghold after the Jack fire of, I believe, was 2008. And we'll finish off with Matt and Ryan of the Klamath County Museum, who will focus again on the images of the Modoc War. So please welcome Todd as we get our program moving.
All right, thanks, Mark. We have about 15 people that have signed in on Zoom. None of us are very good at Zoom, and I'm going to just fiddle with the computer for just a minute here. Super. Thanks. Well, Mark, thanks for the welcome. And this has been such a great partnership we've had the last few months with the museum and the National Park Service staff at the Lava Beds National Monument. Thanks to the Merrill Historical Museum and Modoc War Museum, Greg Matthews, for setting us up with this room here. And if you haven't visited the museum, it's open tonight. And so please do take time to check that out. It's nice to see at least one tribal member. Taylor Tupper is here, descendant of Wainema. And who else have you got?
Councilman Willa Powell.
Yeah, Willa and
my mom. And Bernadine.
wow, okay. So we better get this right, or else you guys will, let us know about it, right? That's great. Ken Sandusky, you still representing the Modoc Nation, Oklahoma. So really glad to have you guys here. That's super. And then Ryan Bartholomew at the Malin Historical Society also teaming up with us tonight. So this has been really great, and looking forward to more events, including the next one next month at the Klamath County Museum. We're going to have a panel of historians discussing how we understand the history of the Modoc War, and are we getting the history right, and so forth and so on. For a series of programs that we're doing, we have consulted with National Park Service and adopted a theme that we're calling a working theme now, because we ran this by the Klamath Tribal Council, and there you go. And they didn't object and they didn't approve, and so we can't say that this is a theme that is approved by the Klamath tribes. But for now, we're going with this theme of remember, reflect, and respect, because this is such a complex and sometimes sensitive subject that we want to make sure that we recognize that there's different perspectives on just about every aspect of the Modoc War. And it's, no single program that we could ever give would capture all there is to know and understand about the Modoc War. And so tonight, we're just going to look at really one sliver of the Modoc War history and talk about how it affects the way we understand the Modoc War. So I'm taking a part of the presentation. Eric Gleason will be sharing with us we hope that he's signed in on Zoom, and then Ryan and Matt will be taking us out. And we have another Modoc descendant with us, Debbie Riddle. Come on in, Debbie. We're set up here so that when you're late, you come in right in front of the whole crowd. Okay with that?
Sun is still coming to the parking lot.
Okay, great. Well, we're just getting started here. Pardon? You can sit there. I don't know how good the view of the screen will be because I'll probably be in your way. You've heard everything I have to say anyway. So one thing I wanted to talk about was how mass communication has been evolving during this entire time before the Modoc War took place and during the Modoc War, and continues to evolve. And the way humans communicate has been changing so rapidly in just the last 150 years of human history. You know, for most of human history, people couldn't communicate at all beyond their village. And then eventually the printing press came along, and then we started to see some mass communication. And the way information travel advanced as well, with the development of railroads and the telegraph, and then radio and television. But even during those times, there were still relatively few channels of communication. I mean, we just had the 3 television networks, right? And a handful of radio stations. But then computers and the internet came along, and now everybody's carrying a cell phone, and we can instantly learn what's going on in Ukraine or in Syria or in Africa or any place in the world. It's so instantaneous. But I sometimes wonder if human understanding is progressing at the same rate. You know, if our compassion for other peoples and other culture is keeping pace. I sometimes wonder. But what I wanted to do tonight with my part of this program tonight was talk about how mass communication was developing during the Modoc War. So where it took months for news and especially images to make it into the hands of the masses in the 1870s when the Modoc War was happening, now it just takes minutes for images to make it around the world. But 150 years ago, it was pretty slow. So I wanted to start with this image of, hey son, how you doing?
Hey.
Thanks for coming. Gleason. So this image may be more popular than any other image we have from the Modoc War. It's one that you've seen so many times, and I'll talk about it a little bit more in detail. But this image was seen more than a month after the incident happened that is depicted in this scene here. But still, this scene that's depicted in this paper represented a great advance in the ability of people around the country and in Europe to be able to know about what was going on here in the Klamath Basin. It was really the first time that thousands of people could read the same account and see the same image and form an impression about what was happening here in the Klamath Basin. In the 1870s, newspapers could not reproduce photographs. They could only reproduce drawing. Now, this is a photograph. How many of you recognize this site here? Yeah, that's in the lava beds. It's Gillam's Camp, taken from a little ways up on the bluff, looking down over Gillam's Camp, about where most of us arrive when we visit the lava beds. But this image could not be reproduced in any magazines of the day, like Harper's Weekly or Frank Leslie's Illustrated News. So they would have to have an artist that would sketch the scene. So here's a sketch from that scene. And so we'll be able to compare and see how similar the drawing is to the image. This was in the London Illustrated News. Let me call that photo back up. And you can see the similarities here. You can see the shoreline in that bay. And that bay, I think, had a name. What was it? Hovey Bay. Hovey, yes, Hovey Bay. Thanks, Ryan. So you can see the drawing that was made of the bay that's just on the edge of the photo there. You can see, the tents maybe aren't exactly the same, but you can see the round circular tents that look maybe more like teepees. And you can see the extension of the lake in the distance there. So it's a fairly good representation based on what the artist saw. The artist might have had that picture in front of him when he drew the sketch. Or Mr. Simpson, the artist, may have climbed up on the bluff and made a pencil sketch and then gone back to his camp to make the actual sketch. So not all drawings were complementary, and some of them were pretty slanted. And so here's one, a sketch that shows President Grant in bed having a nightmare. And he's having a nightmare over two aspects of national politics. One of them involved a black revolt in the South, in Louisiana, and the other was the Modoc War. And here we see a Modoc native creeping up and peeking in the window, not depicted in a very friendly way. But this is the image that people would have formed of the Modoc people based on this sketch that was presented in Frank Leslie's Illustrated News, May 3rd, not quite a month after the assassination of General Canby at the lava beds. Here's another illustration from Leslie's Illustrated News showing it's probably a mortar shell that's gone off in the lava beds. White victory over these Native Americans is being communicated here. And then this very graphic image showing a Modoc supposedly scalping a victim, I think during the April 11th incident. And it's titled "The Two Vultures," and the caption below it reads, "To the victor belong the spoils, thanks the Modoc murderer who interprets the feathered savage in his post-mortem repast." So again, this is the image that people across America would have been forming of Modoc people from this drawing. It's a pretty graphic and disturbing drawing. After the killing of General Canby and Reverend Thomas during the Peace Commission conference, a couple of sketches came out. This one showing a Modoc reportedly having sketched or scalped one of the members of the Peace Commission. Here's an image that was a photograph that was taken at some point during the Modoc War. This is again one of the most common images that you'll see in the history of the Modoc War, often depicting, or a caption will appear with it saying that here's a Modoc warrior getting ready to fire his weapon. Ryan Bartholomew loves to point out that this was not a Modoc at all. It was one of the Warm Springs, is that right? A Warm Spring scout who was posing for this photo here. It was used as the basis for this sketch, though, in Harper's Weekly, June 21st, 1873. And you can see how, in this case, the artist was pretty true to what he saw in the photograph. And the caption here reads, "Modoc brave lying in wait for a shot." So it was not a Modoc at all. So the caption was completely inaccurate, but the art is pretty good. I want to talk a little bit about the artist and the technique that he used to create this image. So this is one of two photos of William Simpson that I have to share with you. William Simpson is the man who drew this image after having visited the lava beds. This is a man who started out in the 1850s drawing art. One of his first assignments was to go from England to the Crimean Peninsula to sketch the Crimean War happening between England and Russia on the Crimean Peninsula. And so he created this image. It's a watercolor, and sent it back. Then he traveled the world during the 20 years after that, and eventually came to San Francisco, where he received orders from his employer, the London Illustrated News, to travel up to the lava beds near the northern border of California and check out what was going there. And so he came and interviewed people. He arrived after the assassination or the killing of General Canby, but he interviewed people, and this was the image that he produced. Zooming in on it, I don't know how well you can see this from the back of the room, but the way this image is created is by the artist taking an etching tool, possibly a knife or just some kind of sharp instrument, and etching into a piece of wood hundreds and thousands of lines in order to create the image. The light parts of the image that you see, like the top of the tent and the hind end of the horse, light colored because there's no lines drawn there. And then where the faces and the uniforms and the clothing are, lots of lines drawn, because when he would cut an etch or and when he would engrave the piece of wood, then ink would be caught in that engraving, and then that would be transferred to the paper to create the image. So it's fascinating to me to just study these lines and his techniques. I'll never be an artist, but I can at least admire the time and the skill it took to create all of those lines at different angles. Notice the line of the tent as it comes down at a diagonal. And so the sky is depicted as a light colored, light shaded in the background, and the tent is a little bit darker with lines that are vertical instead of horizontal. And then lots of lines drawn at various angles in order to create this image. What skill it must have taken after having traveled halfway around the world to end up in the lava beds of all places in the world for this very talented artist to come and produce this sketch. Now you might wonder about the coloring. They had a way to color these images. I don't know how that was done. But it doesn't affect the image at all. I've got a black and white copy of this. And so if I show the black and white copy, you can see that the color didn't really add that much. Just the black and white lines is what creates this image. And it's some interesting technology. I looked up some notes on North Carolina State University's humanities webpage. They said that typically boxwood trees would be used to create these images. They wouldn't use like the side of a board. They would actually cut sections cross grain. You would like be looking at the rings of the tree. They would polish that wood, sand that wood until it had a hard surface, and then etch into the end of the end grain of the wood. Because that wood was so dense and hard, it would hold its image. You could put it on the printing press and you could print tens of thousands of copies because that wood would hold that image and hold the ink. Sometimes it would take several sections of wood in order to create a larger image. And sometimes you can see the lines of where they would join the pieces together. So all of this is what Mr. Simpson had to master in order to produce these images. Photography wasn't able to appear in newspapers until the 1890s, when the process of publishing halftone photos was developed. So from the 1830s to into the 1890s, there is this age when everybody would look at these illustrations and see art that was created by an artist in the field with a knife, etching these images into a piece of wood. I think it's amazing the way they did it. And I also think it's amazing that this man, William Simpson, was assigned by his employer, the London Illustrated News, to come to the lava beds, interview people, create these images, and create what I think is a pretty remarkable image of that scene. And as I look at that image, if I could just back up real quick, to me, what I see in this image is a meeting that has fallen apart, and there's an impasse. And so Captain Jack reached that point where he felt violence was his only recourse. And I feel like, in my opinion, this image is pretty masterful. I would love to hear what some of you think, but I can't take time because I'm probably over my time already. But I would love to hear comments from you on how you feel this image affects you. So I think we're ready to turn it over to Eric.
So yeah, Jacqueline Chung and I are pretty much responsible for this program tonight. We worked at Lava Beds National Monument following the Jack Fire. I'm doing a archaeological survey of the fire. And as part of our work, we really tried to incorporate in some of those images like Todd has been showing you, the photographs and also the illustrations done from the war, just because the Modoc War is a pretty remarkable war in that it was so well documented, at least photographically. So this program starts out in 2 dimensions, and then we'll switch to 3D after a few slides. So I'll let you know when it's time to put on the 3D glasses. For those of you without 3D glasses, some of those images will just look a little bit blurry, but I guess you can't do anything about that. So one of the remarkable aspects about the Modoc War is the wealth of contemporary historical documentation available to the researcher. Various newspapers and news services sent reporters to cover the war from the front. And 2 accomplished photographers also made their way to the lava beds following the capture of the stronghold. and both managed the difficult task of capturing some of the combatants and the occupied territory on glass plates. The historic photographs taken by Lewis Heller and Edward Muybridge document the sites, scenes, and participants of the Modoc War. They were also an invaluable aid in archaeological work in the lava beds, assisting in the identification of constructed features, and allowing the opportunity to assess their condition and providing names to some of the caves and camp locations that we also found in the lava beds. The photographs also reveal detail of the weaponry, equipment, and clothing used by the U.S. Army, the Warm Springs Scouts, and the Modoc. So Lewis Heller arrived at the lava beds less than 2 weeks after the second battle for the stronghold, arriving between April 21st and April 27th and staying for about a week. Following the surrender of Jack and his followers, Heller returned to the lava beds and by June 9th was taking portrait photographs of many of the Modoc prisoners while they were held at Boyle's camp on the east side of Tule Lake near the peninsula. He initially self-published his photographs, producing sets of 21 stereo cards and 25 cabinet views for the curious public. However, by the end of June of 1873, his photographs were being mass-produced in San Francisco by the Gallery of Carleton Watkins. During his time at the lava beds, Heller was not officially employed by the U.S. Army. However, many of his photographs were included in the War Department reports, and quite a few were transformed into newspaper illustrations. For Heller, the trip to the lava beds was a commercial venture, and he capitalized on the notoriety of the war and the fame of the participants. As a side note, Heller's expertise with chemicals, a prerequisite to being a photographer in those early days, was put to use by the U.S. Army. The Wairika Journal of May 7th reported that while in the field, he was called upon to embalm Lieutenant Sherwood, who had been mortally wounded in the attack on Hospital Rock on April 11th. These are some of the newspaper illustrations made from Heller and Muybridge photographs. These reproductions allowed worldwide readership to put faces to many of the names they had become familiar with. This is an illustration which is probably based on a photograph taken by Heller, but we have not been able to locate the actual photograph, just the illustration. So it definitely looks like one taken from a photograph, but we can't really find that photograph. And then both photographers widely advertised their photographs for sale. So this is an illustration of an advertisement for photographs taken by Muybridge, specifically of the Modoc. So Edward Muybridge, the most famous, or the more famous of the two photographers, was a San Francisco photographer who would later pioneer stop motion photography, as illustrated in the lower view on this image. He worked at the lava beds under contract with the U.S. Army. And this was not his first government contract. He had previously photographed the newly acquired territory of Alaska and also West Coast lighthouses. He was born in England in 1830, migrated to the US in 1850 at the age of 20. During his first years in the States, he imported and sold books, starting in New York and then in Los Angeles, before arriving in San Francisco in late 1855. It's a little unclear exactly when he got into the field of photography. So Muybridge had a bookstore in San Francisco, and in 1860, he sold that bookstore to his brother and embarked on a cross-country stage journey with the intention of returning to England. In Texas, the stage he was on crashed, and he suffered head injuries, which would require years of healing and which would change his personality. He was no longer the easygoing man of business. When he returned to San Francisco in 1867, he returned as Helios, photographer of the American West. And the photograph at the top of the page shows him. This is a photographic image taken by Carleton Watkins, who would become his competitor. But at this point in 1872, they were still working together. And this shows Muybridge leaning against a tree in Yosemite. So while he was contracted with the U.S. government, what they really wanted from him was they wanted photographs that showed just how challenging the battlefield was in the lava beds. Of course, they needed to do this to kind of explain why it was so hard for the U.S. Army to route just a few Modocs from this vast area. So one of the things that they did was the U.S. Army sent a cartographer out to map the stronghold following its capture. And so on May 2nd, Muybridge arrived with Captain Garrett Lydecker to document the stronghold in the lava beds area. And Muybridge did so taking at least 54 stereoscopic views. And this image here on this slide is a collaborative map drawn by the cartographer Lydecker and illustrated by 12 photographs taken by Muybridge and numbered 1619, number 1 to number 12. The map shows the photographic locations of each one of these 12 shots and the dimensional view direction of the shot as well. The accuracy of this map, when used out in the field in modern day, made it relatively easy to relocate these photographic locations during our archaeological field. So this map was kind of really key to our understanding of some of the images that Muybridge took to illustrate the war. And basically what Lydecker ended up doing was doing a report on the topography of the stronghold and of the lava beds. And it was an illustrated report, a 3D illustrated report, which was quite remarkable for the time. I don't think any other battles had had that kind of coverage. So this is what the 3D photographs look like today. They're two side-by-side images mounted on a cardboard mount. And so each image is part of a single exposure, but taken through two separate lenses, separated about by the distance of your eyes. So that's what lends these photographs the stereoscopic effect. So now's when it's time to put on your 3D glasses. We're going to start seeing these in 3D. This is the first image in the Heller series. So this is taken up on Gillam's Bluff, looking back down a little to the southeast, showing kind of Scontian Butte and some of the other cinder cones in the lava beds. And this one really kind of gives a dramatic effect of the 3D. You can see in the lower right, kind of the foreground where the basalt cliff is at the edge that he's taking the photograph. This is one of the Muybridge photographs. So this shows a patrol about to go out on reconnaissance. So you can see the conical Sibley tents here at the base of Gillam's Bluff. You can see a rope strung for stringing the cavalry horses. And then the command kind of out mustered in order there. This is a view looking back towards the bluff as well. And in the foreground on the right is what's known as a rock fortification, which is sometimes called the howitzer ring, but I doubt if the howitzers were ever here because their barrels couldn't clear the rock enclosure. It was mostly a defensive feature for when the Modocs shot into the camp, troops could have a place to defend and to escape to. This is a view from the bluff, another Heller view, which shows the cemetery location. And if you can really zoom in on this view, which I unfortunately didn't do, you can see the fresh graves in the kind of in the lower part of the cemetery. So this was a Muybridge view, which was really taken to illustrate the use of extravagant means to extract the wounded from the field. So this is a stretcher used to carry the wounded folks from the field. Because he had access to the Army as an Army contractor, a lot of Muybridge photographs show the U.S. Army troops, whereas few are shown and relatively few are shown in the Heller photographs. So this is the whole command staff of the Modoc campaign gathered together for a photograph. And then this is a picture showing Frank Riddle, O.C. Applegate, Wynema, and several other Modoc women. This was taken in Gillam's camp, and you can see a heating stove there to the left, and some of the tents that were used by the troops. So Muybridge was also took advantage. So the photographic equipment was rather cumbersome, and they used wet plate photographic technique, which exposed the images on a wet plate. And that wet plate had to be developed before it started to dry out. So you had about 10 minutes between exposure and when you had to develop it. So they would carry around portable darkrooms to do this development. So whenever possible, Muybridge would set up in one location and take several shots, and this kind of illustrates it. This one is labeled as the Warm Springs Scouts in the field. So you see them all dressed in their military uniforms, I guess, and showing their weaponry. And in the background, you can see one of the caves at the base of the bluff. And then this one is labeled the Warm Springs Scouts in camp. So he's just basically rotated his view, posed them in a more relaxed setting, and you can see the tents of the troops in the background. And then this is another one taken in the camp. There's a prominent rock which is still there in place. And so he posed Donald McKay and some of the other Warm Springs Scouts against this rock. And the gentleman here, the scout here, is the one that's showed in the next photograph, as Todd had pointed out, a Warm Springs Scout labeled in a photograph as a Modoc. And you can see him armed with a Spencer carbine issued by the US government, and with the stick that helps kind of stabilize it for taking shots. Here's a Heller photograph as well, looking out from the lava beds back towards Gillam's camp. So you can see kind of, this one starts to illustrate some of the challenges that the soldiers faced when trying to march across the northern or the southern shore of Tule Lake towards the stronghold. And then this is a Heller photograph of the location of the Peace Commission tent. And so you can see he describes that you can still see the tent pegs. I think one of them is photographed here, and the trampled grass from remnant from the attack on the Peace Commission. And because Muybridge had more access to the US, even though he was, or to the government, even though he was out there a little bit later, he was able to get them to re-erect the Peace Commissioner tent for his photograph. So you can see the flap of the tent cut away where it had been used to wrap Canby's body. So rather poignant photo as well. So they take, and probably the majority of photographs that both photographers took show Captain Jack's Cave. It was kind of in the central stronghold area and was a focus of the troops trying to capture the stronghold. And it also really shows kind of the roughness of the terrain there. So you can see here's the entrance to Jack's Cave. And you can see in the background soldiers leaning against the wall that the Modoc had built around the cave. So one of the things that it's a little harder to see now because that wall is less intact. It's been changed probably starting during the occupation of the stronghold by the US Army. They deconstructed part of that wall and made their own picket posts out of that wall. So the wall is no longer quite so prominent. Here's another view showing a Modoc fortification looking out back a little bit to the south and west. And you can see at the foot of the fortification, there's a mat for padding as well. So, and then this is the Medicine Flag Rock, which was also one of the focuses of the advancing US troops was to capture the Medicine Flag, which was flying at this location. So once it was captured, it was a pretty popular place to pose the troops. And then this shows the Warm Springs Scouts after the stronghold was captured on the top of the plateau, the stronghold plateau. And in the background was the signal station. So the officers and troops could signal from the different camps. So they'd set up a camp at the stronghold, which you could have actually seen in the background of this photo. These white things are the US Army camp at the stronghold. And then this is the signal station, which was up on the plateau above that camp. And it was used to signal back and forth between the Army camp here and the Army camp at Gillam's Bluff and any other outlying places as well. So a fairly prominent high location that could be used for signaling with flags. What also can be seen in the background when we zoom in a little bit is right back here, you can see a fortification that was built to house the 2 mountain howitzers that the troops fortified the stronghold with after they captured it. And you can see one of the mountain howitzers right here in the corner, and then you can see a gap in the wall where the barrel of the howitzers fit out. And so here's another Heller photograph which kind of details that very fortification. They also just took a lot of shots to try and show just how rugged the terrain was. And in 3D, you can really see the depth of the basins and the height of the ridges and just how rugged things are. Things that you really can't see in a 2-dimensional photograph nearly as well. Then this one is taken at the central portion of the stronghold, what Heller described as where the escape route of the Modocs were from the stronghold. Muybridge once again posed some of the troops inside the stronghold. So this is a location that's right along the public trail through the stronghold. So in the next series of photographs, I'm going to show the historic photographs as an overlay to a modern photograph taken from the same location, kind of showing the same events. So this is the Medicine Rock photograph. Just to the right of where these soldiers are posed is where the main trail into the stronghold kind of comes up onto the plateau. So there's the US Army camp in the background, Medicine Rock here in the center of the photograph. And this is what it looked like in 2008 after the vegetation started growing back from the Jack fire. So you can see not really too changed from that historic view. This is within the stronghold area. This is the cave that's sometimes called Family Cave. On this Heller photograph, it's labeled as Starface Charlie's Cave. The stronghold trail goes right on the top of the cave, about where this tent is where it crosses this photograph. And you can see that there's been a little change here when we go into the modern view. You can see that the top of the cave is dropped down just a little bit. And then these posts are where rope was strung after the fire to try and keep visitors onto the path. So this is that Heller view showing Mason signal station. So the modern stronghold path goes right down the middle of this crack. So these Warm Springs Scouts are posed right at the edge of where the trail goes now. And if you'll notice, there's these rocks in the foreground. We'll fade into the modern view. And pretty remarkably, those rocks in the foreground are still present. So here's that howitzer fortification up at Mason Signal Station. And you'll be able to see just how much it's changed. One of the things that really allowed us to confirm that this was the location of the howitzer was this one rock here, which has rather distinctive features. You won't be able to see it in the recreation because the grass has grown up around it, but we could see it in the field. And you can see that by now, a large amount of that rock, the fortifications has collapsed. So this is a view of Jack's Cave, one that really shows the height of the wall that the Modoc defenders had built around the wall, around the cave. And here's what it looks like today. That wall still exists, but it's much shorter than it was shortly after the capture. And here's that view of the Modoc fortification with the mat below it. And here's what it looks like today with Mount Shasta in the distance. So one of the things that, one of the places that Muybridge photographed was a location that he referred to as Shacknasty Jim's camp. So you can see in this photograph, this is not what it looks like in 3D. This is the 2D image of that camp. So you can see a basket in the foreground. There's a cow, remnants of a cow skull, some matting, things like that in this photograph. And now we'll convert that photograph into 3D so you can see just the difference. So you really get an idea of the depth of that scene with all of these baskets and artifacts in the foreground, this really distinctive triangular rock here, and then this pillar over here, all kind of leading back towards where the Stronghold Trail goes, which is up on top of this ridge. And then here's that location today, that triangular rock, and the pillar is still in place, a little overgrown after the fire. And this is one of Heller's portraits. This is of Shacknasty Jim. And one of the things that we were really honored by in our work out there was to have the help of Chiwa James. And she came out to visit us, and we gave her a tour, and we're able to show her the location of her ancestors' camp within the lava beds. It was a really remarkable and powerful moment for all of us. So back at Gillam's camp, this is what some of the views look like today. So you can see the prominent rock here, Tule Lake in the background, and some of the tents for the US Army. And this gives you an idea of some of the changes that have taken place in the last 150 years. The lake's no longer there. There's now a few junipers, which are probably no longer there after more recent fires and after juniper clearing. But my guess is that some of these junipers were there before the troops came in, just because you have a lot of troops there. They're going to need firewood. They're there in the winter time. So any juniper that was within easy reach was probably harvested for firewood. Here we see the Gillam's camp. And you can really see that this feature, the howitzer ring, is still really there, really prominent, really in the same location. If you compare some of those earlier, more close-up views, you can actually identify rocks within that ring. So it amazingly has survived relatively intact over the years, over generations of visitors, the CCC work that was done at Gillam's camp, all of that things left it remarkably untouched. And so this is the final slide, just to try and give a little bit of credit where credit is due. We've had a lot of help in our work down at the Stronghold, and this kind of shows us going out with Chiwa and Jessica out into the field during one of our visits.
Before I get going, I also want to acknowledge that we do, where the idea for this presentation came, is that Greg Matthews from the museum here let us know that he had copies of the original pictures that were taken by Muybridge and Heller. And so you'll see over here on the side of the room those pictures, and So the museum now in Merrill has each of the portraits that Heller took of some of the participants. And so it's worth a glance. But so I thought I'd start off by sharing a few pictures. First off, this one is by Muybridge. And so a lot of, as Todd was talking about, a lot of the original correspondents were sketch artists or sketch artists visited the scene of the fight to draw up pictures and send them off to newspapers. And you also had correspondents who would sit there and write about what was going on. And that way people away from the conflict could hear. So this was a photograph of a correspondent taken by Muybridge after the conflict. And so one thing that you see pretty frequently in conflict or during wartime photography is images like this of supposed dead. Those did really well in the press. People ate up these images. They loved them, even though they're graphic. People really enjoyed seeing this. And so something that would happen quite frequently is that photographers who would visit the scene of the battlefield would take people and have them pose being dead or wounded. And so this is a photograph from Gettysburg. And a lot of the famous pictures you see are of dead at Gettysburg, but some photographers came late. They made it late and everybody was already gone. The dead were on their way to getting buried. And so this one photographer here had a whole bunch of guys who were there dress up and pretend they were dead. And you know, same thing happened with at least one known picture in the Modoc War, one taken by Muybridge, and you saw it in the last part of the presentation of a wounded trooper. He's not really wounded. The fight was going on elsewhere. There was no reason for a wounded man to be where Muybridge was at this point. So, and all this was to really generate interest, to raise funds. As Eric was saying on there, Muybridge got photographs, and Heller as well, of some of the Warm Springs scouts who were present during the war. And so those of you who aren't really familiar, during the conflict, the Army reverted to a tactic that it used repeatedly throughout the Indian Wars, which was to bring, to hire men from other rival tribes to go and help fight the wars. And so that's what the Warm Springs men were there for. They were, I guess you could almost say mercenaries, but that's not exactly the right term. But anyway, Muybridge, again, he was late to the scene of the conflict, and you saw how he had the supposed wounded man pose. And Eric mentioned that this guy here at the bottom was posed to and labeled as a Modoc warrior. And you'll notice too in the engraving, because some of the engravings were based on photographs, and you'll notice that the engraving on the right, the black and white image, the men who are dressed up in the engraving look pretty similar to the ones who are dressed up in the top left image. And so you'll see that quite often. And we have here on the side one of our Harper's Weekly images. There's one engraving that is labeled as Captain Jack and his men, but it's obviously some of the Warm Springs men. And so people were desperate for these images of Modocs. They hadn't seen them yet. And so at this point, it's almost like they're kind of boogeymen who are hanging out, and nobody really knows what they look like. And so correspondents are just putting in their best guess at what they think they look like. But then you have Heller show up. And so let me give a brief biography of him. He was born in Darmstadt in what later became Germany in 1839. And he came to the US when he was 16 years old in 1855. And he eventually, in the early 1860s, made his way to California, and he opened up a photograph gallery. He had picked up that expertise while living in New York shortly after he arrived in the United States. And so while he was in Wairika, he opened up a photography studio. And but just a few years later, before the start of the Modoc War, he closed that studio, sold it, and moved to Fort Jones, just a little bit away from Wairika. And he eventually moved to San Francisco, where he spent the rest of his life. He had kind of an interesting life. He was a justice of the peace. He was a drugstore owner. So he did a little bit of everything. But when he finally moved to San Francisco, he destroyed all of his pictures that he had taken, all of the glass plate negatives, which is really a tragedy. And he felt that nobody would want them. He felt like they were worthless. And so he destroyed them all. But he did leave a pretty good legacy for us. And in doing so, he provided images of what the Modocs really looked like. So here on the left, you have an image that he got of Warm Springs men that he correctly labeled as Donald McKay and some of the men who captured Captain Jack. But on the right, you have images of actual Modoc participants in the war. This one is labeled Lost River Murderers. We don't really know for sure at this point if they were some of the ones with Hooker Jim, at least not that I know of. But that's just what they got labeled. But for the first time, these images that Heller have taken are starting to go out among everyone to see. And so here's where I'm going to hand it off to Ryan Bartholomew, and he's going to talk more about that.
Thanks. All right, so as mentioned before, so Heller was on the scene during the Modoc War, left, and then once Captain Jack surrendered on June 1st, 1873, Heller returned to the area to get these pictures of the Modocs. So I'm going to take a look at a couple of them here. So just to give you a sense of where this all occurred, Boyle's Camp. So Heller came to Boyle's Camp, which is pretty much where the present day of Newell, California is. So that's where the Army had set up Boyle's Camp. So Heller came in, set up a makeshift studio, and it is believed about June 9th of 1873 is when he took a majority of these pictures here. So this first one I wanted to share, this is probably the most recognizable picture of Captain Jack that you've seen out there. It's been used numerous times in books. Of course, some of the periodicals of the era used it. And right here, front row, we got a shirt that has this picture on it right there. So, and also numerous books throughout time have used this, and also a couple other things. So this was a chewing gum card from the 1950s. So they used this photo as kind of the basis. They churched it up a little bit, put some feathers in, but that was a collectible back in the 1950s there. Also, coins have been minted, several different coins. This one was a series that was put out in the 1980s. It was the Great Indian Chiefs, and they used, again, this picture as the basis for the coin for that. And then another coin that was put out for the 100th anniversary of the Modoc War in 1973 features 3 of this picture here. There was actually a picture of Captain Jack prior to the war, taken in a studio in Wairika, showing him with longer hair. And that was, I know the Modoc tribe of Oklahoma had minted a coin, and that's the photo they chose to use for their coin, which I like that photo much better. It shows him with his longer hair. Here you can see his hair's been cut shorter.
Ryan, who took that photo?
This is a Heller photo.
Give me my money. They want their money back?
I'm not sure who took that photo.
All right.
Yeah, I thought it was the Heller frame because I don't want to read that.
Yeah, and I know in Dan Woodhead's book, it identifies, he says most likely Heller took that photo, but the time frame doesn't really match up because he had moved to Fort Jones by that time. This next photo, this shows Sconch and John and Captain Jack. Now, the thing I really wanted to point out in this picture, it's going to be really hard to see for most of you though, is if you look at the around their feet, the shackles that are around their feet. So these were placed on Sconch and John and Captain Jack on June 2nd, 1873 at the Applegate Ranch up on Clear Lake, on Fiddler's Green and Clear Lake. And so this, again, probably around June 9th of 1873, this picture was taken. Sconch and John and Captain Jack would wear those shackles for the rest of their life. So until the morning of their execution on October 3rd, 1873, those shackles stayed on. We just learned, Todd and I just learned about a month ago that they almost succeeded in breaking the shackles, and it was around what the current day YMCA in Klamath that it was that someone discovered that they had just about got through those shackles and planning to escape. But again, just a really powerful picture showing those shackles, and to think from June 2nd to October 3rd of 1873, those two men were shackled together up there at Fort Klamath in the guardhouse. Eat, sleep. Again, they were tied together for the remainder of their life. This next one here, this is a picture of Captain Jack's family. Now, remember, this is a time where this is probably the first time that any of these women ever saw a camera. So just think how scary that would be, just to go walk into this makeshift studio and be sat down in front of this camera. And probably the most heartbreaking thing about this picture is his daughter, Rose Jack. So a picture there in the front. So these four women were exiled to Oklahoma after the execution of the four Modoc prisoners. And Rose Jack didn't even make it a year. She passed away within a year of arriving in Oklahoma. So I think it's one of the oldest known graves in the Modoc Cemetery back there. And then finally, this picture here, this shows John Fairchild at the far right with Shack Nasty Jim, Hooker Jim, and Steamboat Frank. So these three Modocs were the Hot Creek, part of the Hot Creek Band. So prior to the war, John Fairchild had worked a treaty with the Hot Creek Band. So just in case you're not familiar with it, there was a Hot Creek Band that was located over near the present town of Doris, California, at the Fairchild, near the Fairchild Ranch, the current day Porterfield Ranch. And then Captain Jack was the leader of the Lost River Band, which was based off of Lost River, just a couple miles from here. So these are Hot Creek Modocs here. Now, a couple of things to take away from this. So again, about June 9th of 1873, this picture was taken. 2 days before this, Shack Nasty Jim was being transported from the Fairchild Ranch to Boyle's Camp, him along with a number of other Modoc prisoners. When the wagon driven by James Fairchild, John's brother, approached Adams Point, which is about 5 miles east of here, two masked gunmen approached the wagon and murdered 4 of the Modoc prisoners of war that were in the wagon. So again, Shack Nasty Jim had just experienced that horrific event here 2 days later, taking a picture with John Fairchild. They said if John Fairchild would have been with the group, he probably would have been murdered as well, because there was a lot of hatred towards him in Oregon at that time, just after the war. John Fairchild petitioned several different government officials and government agencies to allow these 3 Hot Creeks to stay, to not be exiled to Oklahoma after the war, because he had such a great working relationship with them prior to the war. But all of his attempts were denied. And all three of these Hawk Creeks were exiled with the remainder of the tribe to Oklahoma.
What part of Oklahoma?
Northeast, yeah. So, yeah, there's, I know there's some Modoc Nation folks here who probably explain it a lot better where that exact location is, but yeah, Northeast Oklahoma. Excuse me?
Up near the Osage.
Yeah. Miami, Oklahoma, I believe it's pronounced Miami, but Miami, Oklahoma. So. But again, really, we all, as historians, we owe a lot of debt to Heller for returning from Wairika to take these pictures post-war. Because again, as Matt said, there was really very little knowledge of what the Modocs actually looked like. There were just a lot of staged pictures with the Warm Springs prior to this. And again, these images live on, and again, they're featured in numerous publications to this day. With that, turn it back over to Todd.
I know there's probably a lot of questions, but we've been here a long time, and so what we'd like to do is invite people to stay and visit with our presenters tonight, Ryan Bartholomew, President of the Lincoln Historical Society, Matt Voelkel, Curator of Klamath County Museum. Don't ask me questions because I'll just direct you to one. Thanks to Son Harrington, traveling member, who provided us with the sound system that saved the day.